She was sent to kill him, but fell in love instead. They told her seduction was the easy part. They showed her his file, his patterns, his psychological soft points like coordinates on a war map, and said with those quiet, gleaming smiles only the Virelian strategists knew how to wear, that he would not last 3 days. He was human. Male. Commander of the outer bastion known as Bastion 12, stationed on the edge of the demilitarized void between Earth's Terran coalition and the fractured remnants of the Zirathian Empire. His name was Commander Jace Rylan. Aged 34. War hero. Politically inconvenient. He had survived more ambushes than most soldiers survive birthdays, and yet they said he would fall because every man has a need buried deep beneath armor and discipline, and her job was to find it and break it. Vexa had been bred for this moment, quite literally. Her skin was smooth with a faint shimmer of lunar frost, her white hair cascading in loose strands over her shoulder like war silk, and those fox-like ears, genetically enhanced to twitch at the subtlest emotional frequencies, made her a living lie detector. She wore the ceremonial furs of an exile bride, a twisted Zirathian tradition now weaponized for espionage, the way her kind had learned to twist everything once sacred into something that could kill. The mission was clear. Get close. Get inside. Gather the codes. Make him love her or make him weak. Then eliminate. It was the final command programmed into the base of her memory strand. But the memory itself was a lie. Her childhood, her training, her identity as a loyal daughter of Aurelia, all of it carefully scripted and inserted into her synthetic cortical web. She did not know she was not real. She only knew what she was told to know. That she was Vexa of House Nerul, the most skilled infiltrator of her generation. That she hated humans. That love was an illusion. That Jace Rylan was the key to destabilizing the coalition from the inside. And that she would succeed. Her arrival was choreographed down to the nanosecond. A stolen refugee pod, drifting into Terran border space, her body weak, her mind half-conscious, her signal just strong enough to register a distress beacon. Bastion 12 responded in 7 minutes. Human efficiency was their weakness. They always came when someone cried for help. Jace Rylan did not come himself. He sent his security team, and the first thing they saw when they opened the airlock was a girl collapsed on the cold metal floor, her white hair soaked with synthetic blood, her pale skin glowing faintly in the emergency lights. Her chest barely moved. Her breathing was shallow. But her eyes fluttered open with perfect timing. The pupils dilated. The lips trembled. The voice whispered just one word. Please. That was all it took. They brought her in. The first part of the mission was complete. The next part required patience, charm, and control. But the first time she saw him with her own eyes, standing at the far end of the observation deck, arms folded, jaw clenched, staring at her through the glass like she was a riddle wrapped in static, something broke in her programming. Not a shatter. Not a scream. Just a flicker. A flicker that should not have been there. He was not what she expected. Jace Rylan was not soft. Not weak. He did not fall over himself to interrogate her or offer comfort. He simply observed. And that was the problem. Because in that moment, Vexa realized he was studying her the way she had been trained to study others. And that meant he saw more than he should. She felt her breath catch not because of fear but because it was the first time she had been looked at not like a weapon, not like an asset, but like a question without a simple answer. And her heart, if that's what she had, began to beat in a rhythm unscripted by mission code. He didn't speak to her for 2 days. During that time, she explored the station with calculated helplessness, her voice soft, her steps hesitant, her wounds healing faster than the medical team could explain. She used every tool at her disposal to manipulate those. She didn't know when it happened exactly, only that it began with something small, something so subtle her internal calibrators never flagged it as a threat, just a flicker in the neural mesh when his fingers brushed against hers during a data pad handoff, just a little too long to be accidental, too deliberate to be meaningless, and yet he said nothing, just looked at her with those damn eyes, always reading, always measuring, always daring her to be something more than the role she was sent to play. And that night she found herself standing in front of the small mirror in her quarters, brushing her fingers across the faint, pale markings on her collarbone, the ones meant to mimic scars of exile, but now they burned as if real, because his gaze had rested there earlier, not out of lust, not even out of suspicion, but like he was trying to see past what was painted on the surface, and for the first time in her short, fabricated existence, Vexa wanted someone to see what was underneath, even if she didn't know what that was, even if there was nothing left beneath the mask but a ghost trying to breathe. So when she walked the corridors the next day and found him alone in the observation deck, watching the dark swirl of space beyond the reinforced glass, she didn't hesitate. She stepped into the silence beside him, shoulder brushing his, and said nothing, just stood there with him, pretending for a moment that she belonged in that stillness, and he didn't look at her. Not at first. He just kept watching the stars like they might whisper something worth listening to, but his hand shifted slightly, just enough to rest on the edge of the console. His fingers splayed in a way that left space she could fill if she dared, and she did, slowly, deliberately, letting her smallest finger grace his, and she felt his breath catch, just for a second, not enough to register on a scanner, but enough for her to feel it, like a ripple in water before the storm begins. And that was when the rules started breaking, not loudly, not all at once, but in quiet, intimate betrayals of purpose, because the moment his skin touched hers, something in her changed, something too deep to patch or override, and she knew she should have pulled away, made an excuse, retreated into the safety of silence and protocol, but instead she stayed, because the warmth of his hand was not something she had been programmed to crave, and yet here she was, craving it, craving him, craving this slow, forbidden closeness like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. And when he finally turned his head and looked at her, really looked, she saw the question forming in his eyes, the one he hadn't dared ask out loud, the one he knew could destroy them both, but she answered before he could speak, lifting her hand and placing it on his cheek, feeling the rough stubble against her palm, the heat of him, the thrum of blood and breath and battle-worn hesitation, and then she leaned in. And the kiss was nothing like the simulations she had been trained on. It was raw and uncertain and filled with all the wrong timing, and it cracked something inside her so violently she forgot to breathe, forgot to lie, forgot the mission, and all she could feel was the way his hand slid to her waist, tentative at first, then firmer, pulling her closer until their bodies aligned like puzzle pieces carved by opposite lives, and she let herself melt into that contact, into that reckless, fragile moment where neither of them were soldiers or spies or enemies, just two beings caught in the gravity of something they were never supposed to have, and when they broke apart she didn't pull away, didn't mask the tremble in her hands or the rising color in her cheeks, because for once she didn't want to hide it, didn't want to calculate what came next, but he stepped back first, just enough to re-establish distance, his voice low and rough, like gravel soaked in regret, as he said, "This can't happen." And she nodded, but didn't step away, because she felt it too, the danger, the impossibility. She woke first, wrapped in the unfamiliar warmth of his body and the soft hush of breath that rose and fell beneath her cheek, and for a single heartbeat Vexa let herself believe it was real, that she was just a woman tangled in sheets with a man who had chosen her not because she was engineered to seduce him but because something genuine had sparked between them. But then the sharp beeping of the COMM console shattered the illusion and her eyes opened to the pale blue of Bastion 12's sterile ceiling, and reality returned like a blade sliding slow into soft flesh. She sat up carefully, watching Jace stir and blink at her, his expression still caught somewhere between sleep and recognition, and for a moment they just looked at each other, neither speaking, neither pretending, and then the intercom crackled again and his name echoed through the room with the urgency of military cadence. "Commander Rylan, we have a situation on Deck 14, and just like that, the world intruded." He was up in seconds, pulling on his uniform jacket with practiced efficiency, but before he turned to leave he paused and looked back at her, his voice low and raw, "Stay here, please," and she wanted to nod, wanted to obey, but something in her pulsed awake, a low-frequency hum in the back of her mind that told her she couldn't afford to wait passively any longer. She was too deep now, too entangled, and the consequences of that entanglement were spiraling out of control. So the moment the door sealed behind him, she rose, pulling the remnants of her clothing back around her body, fingers trembling not from cold but from the certainty that something was shifting beneath her feet, something bigger than lust or doubt or even love, and she accessed the terminal Jace had left unlocked in his haste, because of course he trusted her now, and that trust made her stomach twist because she didn't deserve it, not fully, not yet, but when she pulled up the security logs something caught her eye, something that made the blood in her synthetic veins run cold, a flag transmission routed through a masked channel, encrypted with Virelian diplomatic codes. Someone had sent a signal from inside the station to an unknown receiver in the void, and the timestamp was from less than 6 hours ago. She stared at the screen, heart pounding, because that meant someone else was here, someone else from her creators, and they knew she had made contact, they knew she had broken pattern, and worst of all, they knew she had failed to eliminate the target. Panic surged through her but she forced it down, pushed it into the back of her skull where it could scream all it wanted while she moved, fast, silent, slipping through the corridors like a shadow with a heartbeat, bypassing locked doors with clearance she shouldn't have had but somehow did, because they had planned for this too. Her creators had layered contingency upon contingency, and now she saw the full architecture of her cage, the invisible prison she had carried in her blood and bone from the start, and as she reached the surveillance base she tapped into the internal feeds and rewound the last hour, looking for anomalies, and there it was, a figure in maintenance garb accessing a sealed cargo bay, their face obscured by a helmet, their movements precise and almost too fluid, and something about the way they turned their head toward the camera before disabling it made Vex's skin crawl. Because that wasn't human, not fully, it was one of them. One of her kind, maybe even worse, maybe one of the purifiers, the Virelian sect that hunted deviation with surgical cruelty, and if they were here then she was already marked for deletion, no questions, no trials, just erasure, and Jace would be nothing but collateral, a consequence they wouldn't even pause to grieve. She had to find him, warn him, but the station suddenly jolted under her feet and the lights flickered, alarms flaring to life in a red pulse that painted everything in danger. A hull breach warning echoed through the walls and she ran. They didn't exactly have a plan, which was a bit of a problem considering they were now fugitives inside a military installation that Jace technically still commanded, although given the current situation and the whole assassination protocol activated by an alien kill squad, the chain of command had become more of a polite suggestion than an enforceable reality, and as they stumbled through a dim corridor filled with flickering lights and the faint smell of burned circuitry, Vexa realized she was doing something she had never done before. She was improvising, and it was going terribly, because every door she tried to hack into either spat sparks at her or buzzed with some passive-aggressive denial tone that sounded way too smug for an inanimate object, and Jace, bless him, had that tightly restrained military calm that meant he was either seconds from snapping or already accepting death with noble resignation. You know, he said dryly as she yanked on yet another stubborn panel, I always hoped if I died in the line of duty it would be with a little more dignity and a lot less running around in my socks, and she looked down and realized, yes, he was absolutely barefoot, shirt half buttoned, and still somehow managing to look like he belonged on a recruitment poster, which just made her more annoyed, because she felt like a half-melted snow fox in battle mode underwear and disheveled hair, glowing faintly like a radioactive mistake. You didn't grab your boots, she said. Incredulous, and he shot her a look. We were a little busy if you recall, and okay, fair point, but still, it was hard to strategize when her heart kept lurching at how ridiculous they looked, like the galaxy's most underprepared rebellion, and she almost laughed, almost, because if she let herself start she might not stop, but the absurdity gave her just enough clarity to remember an old maintenance shaft tucked behind the auxiliary coolant chamber, something no one had touched in years. Because it smelled like regret and mold, but it might just get them to the old operations bay where they could reroute station controls manually, assuming the purifier hadn't already melted that section into slag. So she led him there, one hand still gripping his like an anchor, and when they reached the shaft she paused and turned to him. I need to go in first, it's a vertical drop and the ladder might not hold both of us, and he nodded, then promptly misjudged the edge and nearly slipped in head first, catching himself with a flail that ended with his face pressed against her chest, which would have been sexy in literally any other context, But here it just made them both freeze in mortified silence before he muttered, "Sorry, gravity betrayal," and she just sighed, "Focus, soldier," and slid down into the dark, the metal cool and greasy beneath her fingers as she climbed, every creak echoing like a scream. But they made it, both of them landing in a forgotten sub-level lit by emergency glow panels that hummed like broken dreams, and for a second they stood there in the stillness, catching their breath, until Jace reached over and brushed a smudge of coolant from her cheek, and it should have been sweet, it should have been tender, but his thumb caught on a pressure point in her jaw and triggered a reflex that made her knee jerk straight into his thigh, dangerously close to biological territory he would definitely miss, and he doubled over with a strangled noise. Eyes wide, what the hell was that? And she stared in horror. I don't know, it's a reflex, maybe a fail-safe, I didn't mean to, are you dying? And he waved her off while trying to walk it off with dignity, which was impossible with that much limping involved, and she bit back a laugh that nearly turned into a sob, because this was their life now, dodge death, kick each other in the reproductive systems, save the station, fall in love, maybe die, hopefully not in that order, but they reached the ops bay without further incidents, and she set to work at the manual console, her fingers dancing over the ancient. The silence inside the escape pod was not like the silence of space outside, not cold or endless, but warm and charged, filled with the sound of breath and pulse and the faint humming of a life support system too outdated to mask the electricity in the air between them. And as Vexa leaned her head against Jace's shoulder, she felt his arm slide around her back, slow and tentative, like he wasn't sure if comfort was allowed between fugitives whose world had just gone up in flames, but she leaned into it anyway, because right now touch was the only thing grounding her, and his body was steady and strong and achingly familiar in a way that made her chest feel too small for her heart. They didn't speak for a long time, just sat there watching the stars streak past a tiny viewport, the remnants of Bastion 12 still glowing in the distance like a dying ember, and it hit her then that she had nothing left, no mission, no home, no future mapped out in someone else's design. She was free. And the terrifying beauty of that thought sent a shiver down her spine. She felt his hand move then, not away but deeper, fingers pressing gently against the small of her back, as if he could feel the change inside her and wanted to anchor her to the present, and she looked up at him, searching his face, his eyes, wondering if he would pull away now that the world was no longer crashing around them, but he didn't. He just looked at her like she was still worth choosing even without the pretext of danger, and slowly she reached up and touched his face, tracing the edge of his jaw, the roughness of stubble under her fingers, the faint scar near his temple that she had noticed before but never had the nerve to ask about, and he tilted his head into her touch like it was something precious, something he'd missed without realizing it, and then their lips met again, not with the desperate heat of before but with something quieter, something deeper, a slow burn that made her body ache in places she'd never felt real before. He kissed her like he was memorizing her, like every movement mattered, and when she pulled him closer and straddled his lap he didn't resist, didn't speak, just let his hands glide along her thighs, her hips, her back, every inch of contact reverent but unafraid. She felt his fingers slip under the edge of the fur still clinging to her shoulders, felt the chill of the pod's recycled air against her skin as he slid the fabric away, exposing the pale shimmer of her collarbone, the pulse at her throat, the soft curve of her chest, and he paused there, his eyes searching hers again for something unspoken, and she gave him the smallest nod, as signal, as surrender, and that was all he needed. He bent his head and pressed his lips to the base of her neck, slow and deliberate, his mouth warm against her cool skin, and the sensation unraveled something deep inside her, made her arch slightly against him as his hands moved up her sides, learning the shape of her like he was discovering a new language. She felt the fur slide off completely, pulling around her knees, leaving her in the thin underlayer of her infiltration suit, and he tugged at the seams gently, fingers finding the hidden clasps with more care than she expected from a soldier, and when it came apart she let him peel her open inch by inch until there was nothing between them but heat and breath and the quiet rhythm of need. His hands were calloused but precise, strong but never rough, and she found herself gasping when his mouth followed the path of his hands, tasting her with a hunger that was tempered by awe, like he couldn't believe she was real, and her body responded in kind, each nerve alight with a fire of sensation she had never been taught to expect, Her programming had prepared her for seduction, for mimicry, for the dance of pleasure as manipulation, but this was different. This was raw and real and devastating in its intimacy, because every touch from him made her feel more like herself and less like the weapon she had been designed to be, and when she didn't notice the blinking red indicator until well after they had both drifted into that strange space between sleep and alertness, the kind of quiet that feels earned after everything has been burned down behind you, and it wasn't the color of the light that pulled her from that warm haze wrapped in Jace's arms, but the pattern, slow then fast, a code buried in her memory deeper than words or thoughts, and her breath caught because she had seen that pulse before in training simulations. They told her to forget, in contingency files that were never supposed to activate unless she had gone completely rogue, which meant someone had triggered the Omega Protocol, the last fail-safe for compromised infiltrators, a signal that did not call her back, but called something else to her, something worse, something final, and she sat up in the dim light of the pod with her skin suddenly cold despite the warmth of the man still dozing beside her. She tried to silence the alarm, but it wasn't one she could control. It was hard-coded into her neural mesh, a ghost order sent across frequencies older than the war itself, and she knew, without needing to look at coordinates, that something was coming, something fast and precise and utterly merciless, designed not to extract her but to erase her completely along with anything she had touched, and as she stood there frozen, trying to decide whether to tell Jace or lie for just one more hour of borrowed peace, the pod's emergency systems flickered and a soft ping echoed through the walls, proximity alert, and that was all it took for him to stir, to see her face, and sit up without asking questions, because he knew her well enough now to read the fear without hearing the words. "What is it?" he asked, his voice hoarse and already laced with steel, and she opened her mouth to explain but the words didn't want to come, so instead she walked to the control panel and projected the external sensors, and there it was, the answer she hadn't wanted, a single ship approaching at sublight speed, sleek and black and unmarked, no COMM signal, no identification, just a shadow sliding through the void like a blade through silence, and Jace looked at it and then at her, and didn't need to ask the next question. "They are not here to talk, are they?" And she shook her head slowly. "They are not even here for you," and he processed that for a second, jaw tight. "So what do they do? Vaporize the pod?" And she nodded. "Or board it? Neutralize me, wipe the systems, maybe leave you drifting," and the way he said nothing for a long moment told her he had already accepted worse, already imagined endings with more fire and fewer goodbyes, but what he did next caught her completely off guard, because instead of preparing for battle or demanding answers he just walked over and kissed her, slow and hard, like it might be the last time, and whispered, "Then we don't give them the chance," and she pulled back confused. "Jace, we can't outrun that thing. It's faster, stealth-equipped, and you have no idea what kind of operative they've sent," and he gave her a smile that should not have been possible under the weight of everything about to hit them. "No, but I do know one thing," he said, reaching into the floor panel and pulling out a small metallic device she hadn't noticed before. "This pod's old enough to still have a decoy beacon. You light it right, makes a perfect copy of our signature and burns bright enough to mask an escape," and she blinked at him, stunned, because he wasn't just improvising. He was adapting like a soldier trained in more than strategy. He was planning like a man who had already made peace with the idea of dying but was trying damn hard not to, and something about that made her want to weep and fight at the same time, and she helped him set the beacon, recalibrating the signal to broadcast a false trail into the nearest asteroid belt, while they set the pod's manual override to drift slowly on the opposite vector, and it wasn't perfect, it wasn't even smart by most tactical standards, but it When Vexa woke up, her head resting on something warm and very much alive, she spent a solid 15 seconds trying to remember if she had just dreamt a galactic brain-frying showdown with a death ship or if she had actually hijacked her own neural mesh and blasted a purifier vessel into unconsciousness using the sheer force of unresolved identity issues, and judging by the very concerned expression on Jace's face as he hovered over her while attempting to pour hydration gel into her mouth with all the grace of a man who had never seen a squeeze pack before, it was definitely the latter. "You're alive," he said, with a kind of awe and mild panic only a military commander could compress into 2 words while also managing to squirt half the gel up her nose, and she coughed, sputtered, then glared at him through watering eyes. "If you ever try to nurse me again, I'm setting your boots on fire," and he gave her a sheepish half-smile that somehow still made her chest flutter like she wasn't just barely clinging to consciousness. "Noted," he muttered, "but in my defense, the instructions are written in 17 languages and none of them are Terran," and she rolled her eyes, sitting up slowly, the blanket slipping down her shoulders to reveal the faint shimmer still trailing across her skin. A side effect of what she'd done, the feedback loop hadn't just sent out a signal, it had rewritten her boundaries, temporarily turning her into a living transmitter of raw psychic energy, and now her body was recovering by glowing like a misplaced starlight festival, which was both slightly poetic and incredibly inconvenient, especially when the only clothes she had left were a half-zip suit and Jace's jacket, which he was currently not wearing because, in a moment of irrational heroism, he had stripped it off to cover her while she was unconscious, leaving himself in nothing but his undershirt and a pair of boxers that had definitely seen better days. "So," she said, after a beat, "any chance we can pretend I didn't just weaponize my soul and knock out a warship with emotional trauma?" And Jace looked like he was about to make a joke, stopped, reconsidered, then said, "Only if we also pretend I didn't cry a little when I thought you were gone." And she blinked, surprised. "You cried?" And he nodded, "Just a little, very manly tears," and she couldn't help the laugh that escaped, soft and genuine and so startling it made them both pause, because humor had no place in missions like this, and yet here it was, sitting between them like a fragile gift, and she reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his with a gentleness that felt like rebellion. "You're ridiculous," she whispered, and he kissed her knuckles. "I know," and then the pod beeped, because of course it did, because the universe had a sense of timing so cursed it bordered on malevolent, and a chime echoed through the small cabin, announcing incoming contact from a coalition patrol ship, which should have been good news, should have made her breathe easier, except she wasn't exactly thrilled about explaining to the military that she was technically a repurposed infiltration unit who may or may not have recently committed psychic warfare against a classified target, and Jace must have sensed it, because he stood and began to pace, the way he always did when planning how to spin chaos into a survivable report. "All right," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "They'll want answers, and we're going to give them exactly enough to not get shot." And she raised an eyebrow. "So we're lying," and he gave her a look. "We're curating," and she groaned. "You are dangerously good at euphemisms," and he grinned. "That's why they pay me the medium bucks." But then the transmission connected and the display lit up with the face of a stern-looking coalition officer whose haircut was sharp enough to qualify as a weapon, and Jace snapped to attention. "Commander Rylan, requesting immediate evac. Escape pod designation Bravo 7, survivors aboard, hostile threat neutralized, and th." It wasn't the medals or the commendations or even the formal apology from the Coalition Ethics Board that made it feel like an ending. It was the way the air smelled when they stepped off the transport onto the surface of Kessery 9, warm and mineral-rich, touched by ocean winds and distant thunder, a place that had once been just another way station but now looked like something out of a dream painted with second chances. The sky overhead was a strange shade of violet and the clouds moved like they had nowhere urgent to be, and for the first time since she had first opened her eyes in a sterile lab on Virelia, Vexa felt like she belonged in her own skin. The glow had faded days ago, the tremors in her mind quieted by the neural stabilizer the medics had begged her to accept, and while the old signals still lingered somewhere deep inside her, they no longer held power, just echoes of a system that had lost control of its creation. And Jace walked beside her not like a guardian or a commander or a soldier trying to keep her safe, but like someone who had decided that being hers was the only mission that mattered anymore. They'd been given provisional residency on Kessery as part of a diplomatic initiative to study the integration of former synthetic agents, which was the Coalition's way of saying they had no idea what to do with her but couldn't justify locking her away after the entire damn galaxy had watched her destroy a Purifier-class vessel with nothing but the force of her own consciousness. The story had gotten out, not all of it but enough, and while the official narrative painted her as an asset repurposed for peace, the underground networks had dubbed her something else entirely, the Heartbreaker Protocol, which made her groan every time she heard it, and Jace delighted in bringing it up at the most inappropriate moments, especially whenever she was trying to make a serious point during Coalition outreach seminars. "You know they think you can explode hearts just by flirting, he whispered once during a very somber speech from a high-ranking admiral, and she had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. But humor was what kept them grounded, that and a small routine they built together, mornings on the veranda of their temporary housing unit, drinking something hot and vaguely caffeinated while reading intercepted transmissions from across the sector like they were gossip columns, long walks through the geothermal gardens, where strange bioluminescent plants bloomed and occasionally tried to sing, late nights tangled in sheets and soft words, not always about love, sometimes just about how the stars didn't look the same anymore after everything they'd seen, and the awkwardness didn't vanish, not entirely. She still overcorrected in conversations, sometimes froze when someone touched her without warning, sometimes forgot that she didn't need to scan every room for threats, and Jace, for all his charm and dry wit, still had nightmares that woke him with a start, eyes wide, and pulse racing, but he always found her hand in the dark, and she always held on, even when neither of them spoke, especially then, and one evening, just as the second moon was rising and casting long shadows across the cliffs, he knelt in the garden with a ring made from repurposed circuit plating and asked her if she wanted to keep building something stupid and beautiful with him, and she stared at him like he had just offered her the entire cosmos wrapped in the kind of ridiculous logic only he could deliver, and then she said yes, not because it was traditional or expected, but because the idea of not saying yes felt like betraying everything she had fought to become. They didn't have a wedding in the conventional sense, no grand ceremony or protocol officers or flower arrangements designed by interstellar decorators. Instead they had a circle of friends gathered on a high ridge, a recycled signal beacon repurposed as a music note playing distorted classical tunes, and a vow that simply said we survived, and now we choose, and